So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the next series of talks in our Colloquium series. We are very glad and honored to have with us one of the main energy-related experts in Cyprus, Dr. Charles Ellinas, who has about 35 years of experience in the oil and gas and more generally in the energy sector. He is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and also a CEO at this consultancy firm, ECNHC. Right? He has worked at McDonald for 25 years, since 10 years ago. Then he was the CEO of the National Hydrocarbons Company of Cyprus. And he is currently a consultant in the private sector. Of course, he will be talking about a very timely and topical issue, the energy crisis, and what he expects the prospects of them to be. Good afternoon also to our online participants, and thank you, Mr. Ellinas, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Theodoros, for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be with you. I was here about 3 years ago, can't remember, when I gave my last presentation. I come into this from the industry, not from R&D. And I'm going to present you a view that may be a little bit controversial, and yet I believe it's pragmatic. That's why the title is called, Will the Energy Crisis Become a Recurring Phenomenon? I mean, energy transition is not an overnight process. It will take time. And while it is happening, the world energy needs carry on increasing, along with the need to secure reliable energy supplies. Low energy, intermittent renewables are not yet in a position to deliver that, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. The energy crisis is forcing governments to reconsider their priorities, with energy security and affordability coming to the top and climate change dropping down the list. It will take a long time before energy security ceases to be top priority, and not before the problems of reliability and long-term intermittency of renewables are satisfactorily resolved. Just to go back a little bit, in the 1970s, coal use was prioritized in order to lower energy costs. And this did not change until the 1990s, when the environment and climate change gained importance. In other words, it took over 20 years for the world to shift priorities. And I believe the same is going to happen now. The importance of energy security that has shaken the world during the last 2 years will be with us for a long time to come, alongside dealing with climate change in parallel. As a result of this, the majority of countries at COP27 did not support phasing down oil and gas and agreed to boost low emissions energy, interpreted to include natural gas. In effect, for me, COP27 signaled a shift from mitigation to adaptation. You may not see it that way, but I believe that's where we're going. The world is now paying for misguided policies based on committing to a rapid energy transition, mistakenly assuming that sufficient alternatives to oil and gas would already be in place at scale. This proved to be premature and did not materialize, but it introduced uncertainties about the future of fossil fuel demand that led to underinvestments in this sector and resulted in tight oil and gas supplies and inevitably, as demand went up, high prices. While the world is investing in increasing use of renewables, including green hydrogen, energy efficiency and developing the technologies needed to transition to clean energy, a pragmatic energy transition will need natural gas for a long time to come. Unless this is recognized, this may not be the only energy crisis the world will be facing. We'll come back again and have more energy crises until renewables come up to scratch. Even looking at it from the point of view of finance, even BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, recognized this when he said, I actually believe we are going to need hydrocarbons for another 70 years. These are the people who are funding these things. And believe me, they don't invest in these projects just for the sake of it. They need to make money. We expect to remain long-term investors in carbon-intensive companies because they play crucial roles in the economy and in a successful transition. BlackRock sees this as a pragmatic commitment alongside investments in decarbonization, which it does. They invest in that as well. So climate change is impacting renewable energy. Renewable energy resources which depend on climate are susceptible to climate change. A report published last year by the World Meteorological Organization, that was in November, concluded that over the past 30 years, Europe's temperature has been rising twice as fast as the global average, impacting its climate. This also results in faster Arctic heating, which in turn may underlie the unusual wind patterns observed in Europe in the summer of 2021, characterized by a prolonged period of low wind speeds, as much as 20% lower than the annual average. As the Arctic gets hotter, the temperature difference with the equator narrows, weakening the jet stream, causing global stealing, wind speeds dropping over long periods. In Europe, some of the most pronounced cases of low wind speeds have come over the past decade. With the power generated proportional to the cube of the wind speed near the surface, even small changes can have a significant impact. Low wind speeds are now becoming a challenge for Europe due to its increasing dependence on wind energy. Most of the investment in Western Europe on renewables is on wind energy. In the summer of 2021, this led to a significant shortfall in power production that had to be provided by natural gas, making the energy, contributing to the energy crisis. With the poles warming faster than the equator, this is likely to be a global recurring phenomenon. Climate change is also affecting rainfall, with long periods of drought, impacting hydroelectricity and nuclear power that requires water for cooling. Dealing with this requires diversification of energy supplies, not just renewables, but also natural gas and better storage options, as well as long-term weather forecasting in the energy sector. It's either gas or coal, basically. And right now, what we have in Europe is more coal and less gas because of the cost of gas. Until the problem of long-term intermittency is solved, renewables will need to be supported by natural gas to ensure reliability and security of supplies. Another challenge is that the required technology to store surplus electricity long-term at scale does not yet exist. Renewables have a long way to go. So far, most of the effort has concentrated on increasing use of renewables and reducing or even eliminating use of coal in the power sector. But this is proving to be very hard. In fact, over the last 2 years, because of the energy crisis, globally, the use of coal is going up. In Germany, for example, the use of gas went down 25% last year, and the use of coal went up 20%. The use of renewables in other sectors has not progressed as much, particularly in industry, the largest energy user that consumes more than a third of global final energy demand. Adding renewable energy to the electrical grid will not solve the climate crisis on its own. Taken together, transportation, industry and heating and cooling make up the lion's share of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So solving the electricity problem is not going to solve the problem in total. Energy transition, and this is where the world is concentrating right now. Energy transition is happening, but not at the pace required to match growth in overall global energy demand and to achieve transformation within the targeted timescale. In other words, to achieve net zero by 2050. And now energy security concerns are acting to delay the process even further. According to a new study by Bloomberg NEF, getting to net zero by 2050 will cost an average of about $6.6 trillion per year every year from now to 2050, starting now, this year. And guess what was spent last year? $1.1 trillion on green technology in total. In other words, 6 times less than what is needed to achieve that. So we have a problem here. But current investments come to only about a quarter to a sixth, as I said, of what is needed. As a result, according to the IEA, additions to global renewable energy capacity have stabilized rather than accelerated during the last few years. So, I mean, we need to see that curve going up fast. And you can see from there, from 2020 onwards, it went up. But since then, it hasn't really gone up. I mean, investments have gone up because inflation is going up and the cost of materials is going up, but the actual amounts of renewable energy are not going up. Global energy demand will carry on growing. There is a clear link between population growth, economic growth, and energy needs. With the world population expected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050 from 8 billion now, global energy needs will carry on growing. And with Chinese and Indians and other developing countries aspiring to improve their living standards, based on known policies and trends, primary energy demand is expected to increase close to 20% by 2050. Sorry. So this is what BP's Energy Outlook published end of January shows based on the new momentum scenario designed to capture the broad trajectory along which the global energy system is currently traveling. So don't look at accelerated and net zero. Those are designed to achieve a target by 2050. This is not what is happening now and over the next 10 to 15 years. What is happening now is shown by new momentum, and energy demand is growing. Bloomberg NEF's A New Energy Outlook 2022 points out that as variable technologies, wind and solar become highly prevalent in the global power mix, they also create the need for firm power, baseload generators, preferably gas-fired combined with CCS, carbon capture and storage, that are always available and reliable during periods when wind and solar are less or not available. Some of that firm power is needed in short intervals, but some of it could also be needed for months or even longer. BNEF concludes that firm power will not leave the net zero grid. Far from it. It will be with us for a long time. So what is the impact on Europe? In Europe, the most energy-intensive sectors are already suffering, with a growing number of companies halting and even permanently shutting down operations. Europe's major gas-consuming industries, including chemicals, food processing, steel and paper, generate economic value of more than $600 billion per year and employ almost 8 million workers. Those areas are those at risk. And you probably heard that in Germany, BASF is shutting down its operations and moving them to the United States already. They have made the decision to move to the United States. That's massive deindustrialization that is going to hurt Europe. Europe now faces substantially higher fuel import prices in the absence of Russian gas. OECD countries that include Europe will be spending 17.7% of their GDP this year on energy. 17.7% of OECD countries' GDP will go on energy. About 60% higher than the average over the last 20 years. Clearly, there is a need to find new sources of cheaper energy or risk deindustrialization. That's why among many European countries there is increasing awareness that steeper climate ambitions may be counterproductive, given the risks to European industry, but also given increased costs to consumers. Repurposing industry, especially heavy industry and chemicals, to low-emission technology will take a long time and huge investments, and it is unlikely that it will be a panacea. Europe faces strong competitive challenges with China, the US, and Japan, and others having access to cheaper energy. How are you going to compete? We're introducing CBAM, the border tax. That will not save Europe. It might go some way in protecting EU business from cheaper imports, but competing in global markets will be challenging. Russia is already redirecting its energy exports to Asia, and in particular China, at low prices. I mean, Russia is selling its oil now to Asia at a 30% discount to Brent. And it's selling a lot. In December, these were the exports to China were 16% higher than previously contracted. With a new gas pipeline, Power of Siberia 2, progressing, by 2030, Russia will be exporting more than 100 billion cubic meters of gas to China, and even more as LNG, at substantially lower prices than gas costs Europe at present. And if we substitute gas with hydrogen, it will be even more expensive, if we can do it, because up to now, hydrogen is not rising to the challenge. These developments put pressure on Europe to secure new sources of cheaper energy, in particular cheaper natural gas. An EU policy reversal, recognizing that we will need gas longer term, can unlock development and export of secure and competitive gas at its doorstep, here, from the East Med and the Middle East and North Africa, around the Caspian and Africa. Gas that currently is not being developed. The oil companies made it clear to Europe they will not develop this gas unless they are able to sign long-term contracts. And with European policies not encouraging that, it's not happening. We in the East Med have about over 600 billion cubic meters of spare gas at the moment to export. It could provide Europe with 25, 30 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That is about a sixth of the Russian supplies. Substantial amount. It is not happening, simply because companies like ExxonMobil say, well, thank you very much, but unless we have long-term contracts, we are not going to invest and do that, invest billions of dollars. We need a pragmatic energy transition. A report published by the Manhattan Institute in August calls for a reality check to the delusion that energy transition will eliminate the use of fossil fuels. It states that global economies are facing a potential energy shock. Energy costs and security have returned to the center stage, as has the realization that the world remains deeply dependent on reliable supplies of oil, natural gas, and even coal, as we know that is happening now. According to this report, the world is beginning to grasp the enormous difficulty of just replacing Russian hydrocarbons, never mind the impossibility of trying to replace all of society's use of hydrocarbons with solar, wind, and battery technologies. And in any case, Russian hydrocarbons are not being replaced. They are largely being displaced and being used by others, not by Europe, but by others. Global, I mean, we are in the ironic situation right now where Russian oil is going to India, is turning to diesel and comes to Europe. Even though we put an embargo on Russian diesel, we are buying Russian diesel from India, not directly. Global demand for oil and gas, natural gas continues to increase as the global economy continues to grow following the pandemic. The share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix has been stubbornly high at around 80% for decades, and it will be so this year. Forecasts based on achieving the goal of net zero by 2050 are aspirational, goal-setting than real. You set up a target and you change. I mean, you try to achieve it. That's great. Okay, you know it shows what you need to do, but it's not really. It's not reality. That's what we all want to see. We want to see net zero. And the world must endeavor to achieve it, while at the same time ensuring secure and affordable supplies for the world's growing energy needs all the way to 2050. Transition to clean energy is crucial to the world's future, but many questions remain unresolved. At present and in the foreseeable future, reality is different. Even though much of this energy growth is likely to be provided by green energy, based on known policies and trends along which the global energy system is currently progressing, as in the IEA's International Energy Agency STEPS scenario, in real terms, oil and gas demand will remain close to today's levels by 2050. And you can see from there, the bottom is oil, in the middle we have coal, and the top gas. You can see that coal is going down, but it's not being eliminated. Gas is remaining more or less steady, and oil carries on increasing. This is based on current trends. Hopefully this will change at some stage in the future, but it's not happening now, for sure. This could, of course, change if the world takes aggressive measures to reduce dependence on oil and gas, but that is still to happen. And certainly the current energy and economic crisis and the fact that the required technology and infrastructure is still being developed are delaying such action. Unquestionable faith and optimism alone will not make it happen. Assuming that the required technology and infrastructure will be there when needed is not enough. And it's a bit I'll tell you a little joke here that I heard not that long ago. An engineer and an accountant are marooned on an island, and they can't find anything to eat. And suddenly they find a box with cans of beans, but they cannot open the cans. So the engineer goes around trying to find a can opener or something to open the cans. He comes back and says to the accountant, "I'm sorry, I cannot do that. I haven't found anything." "What is your problem?" he said. "I need a can opener." He said, "Oh," he said to him, "no problem. Assume you have one." That doesn't solve the problem, I'm afraid. And pushing the world to gamble its future on such faith is more than risky. It's foolhardy. And in effect right now, sometimes, advocacy is taking precedence over analysis and reality, and that doesn't solve the problem. Even the International Energy Agency concluded in its September report that the clean energy economy is gaining ground, but greater efforts are needed to get on track to net zero by 2050. Of the tracked 55 components of the energy system that are critical for energy transitions, only 2 are fully on track with the net zero by 2050 scenario trajectory. Only 2. That doesn't solve the problem. In addition, the procurement of raw materials and critical minerals needed for green energy systems is also facing major challenges and increasing costs still to be addressed. The transformation we need to go through is complex and massive. We can see that the elements we are driving at today are not sufficient. There is now recognition that energy transition needs to be based on energy security. In other words, adequate and reasonably priced energy supplies to ensure public and political support. Without it, nothing is going to happen. The two must go hand in hand. This is why the world needs a pragmatic energy transition that recognizes that until the required green technology is available, adequate and reliable, natural gas and fossil fuels will remain a key part of the global energy mix all the way to 2050. Thank you. I'd be very happy to answer questions.
We'll have some microphones.
Hello. Yeah, hello. Am I on? All right. Hi, Dr. Ellinas. Good to see you again. Wasn't it the assumption that energy transition would proceed as, you know, not in a state of urgency, but as you've described before, and that the, well, it would proceed to 2050, as people thought, but then, you know, the Ukraine war was injected into that scenario. And hasn't that set created a certain amount of panic regarding to securing supplies and redirecting investments to more oil and gas, as is BP self-announced the other day? I mean, it seems like that, you know, the war in Ukraine has been a real spoiler. Do you see it sort of like that in any way?
Yeah, I mean, the war in the Ukraine came afterwards. The energy crisis started in 2021, before the war. The war made it more difficult and focused the minds. But sadly, Europe is not changing its tune. If anything, Europe is suggesting now that we should accelerate energy transition, make it faster. And that's why Europe still has policies that say that by 2030, gas utilization in Europe needs to go down by 30%, must go down by 30%. Repower EU, which is the flagship of European energy policies. That's what it says. And beyond 2030, we must get rid of it altogether. It's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. Everything I have showed you supports that there is a problem, and Europe needs to change its tune. Even President Biden has changed his tune. I mean, just earlier on, last week, I believe, when he made his State of the Union speech, he admitted now that, oh, well, we, Americans, will need oil for at least 10 more years, if not more, he said. Because there is a realization that it's one thing to set targets and try to achieve energy transition, which must happen. We must have targets. We must strive to do it. But at the same time, we cannot blindly follow the targets and not follow reality. We need to be able to provide reliable energy. Right now, renewables alone don't provide it. And in the foreseeable future, renewables alone don't provide it. There is some way to go before we achieve that transition. And that's what I'm trying to present, and that's what I write about quite often in publications where I publish, that we need to have this balance between aspirational targets and reality. The world to function needs reality, not just targets.
So is it essentially a matter of where investments are being channeled? Could it be that, you know, now because of this panic about energy security, companies are choosing to put more into exploration and development and ignore what they could do as far as renewables, or?
Well, Well, it comes to a question of money, and some of the oil companies are increasing their investment now in exploration and production, but they're not going back to pre-pandemic levels, simply because they're not sure until the United States and Europe come and say, yes, we agree that we are going to need this gas longer than 2030, and we are willing to sign long-term contracts. They are not going to invest. So they're increasing their investment, but not a lot. BP last week announced a change of direction, yet again. It's not the first time that BP does it. So previously they had a target to get rid of 40% of their fossil fuels by 2030 and replace them by renewables. Last week they said, we can't do that anymore. So we're going to bring this target down to 25%. And by the way, on the way there, we're going to increase our spending on fossil fuels, on oil and gas, by 8 billion over the next 7 years. So there is a change of direction, but it's not just BP and the oil companies. It's what is happening globally. As I mentioned to you what BlackRock said. BlackRock is there to make money. Doesn't care very much, well, cares about the climate, but at the same time cares about making money. And they realize that if they blindly focus their investments on renewables and stop investing in oil and gas, it won't solve the problem. So they are also being pragmatic.
Okay, so thank you very much. Just as a follow-up, as you say, it's a great, let's say, challenge to keep this balance between energy transition and energy security. I'm just wondering from the practical point of view, I mean, based on your experience and your expertise, what would be, let's say, 2 or 3 measures that, for example, the new government next week could take at the national level?
A key measure is to accept that oil and gas won't disappear by 2030. I mean, once you accept that, it really balances the equation, because there is no question that investments in renewables will carry on increasing. There is every evidence to show that every year the amount of money invested in renewables is increasing. Not fast enough to achieve net zero by 2050, but it's increasing. That isn't going to change, and the energy crisis brings in a realization that ultimately, if we want to get rid of the problems and improve energy security, countries need to produce as much of the energy they consume locally. And how can they do it? By renewables. But until renewables are up to scratch, you cannot just turn off oil and gas. And this is where the fallacy has been so far, that the advocates of clean energy say, stop oil and gas. You have Extinction Rebellion closing highways, throwing whatever the soup on Van Gogh's painting in the National Gallery. That isn't going to take us anywhere. Doesn't solve anything. And here, I mean, some people doing that in Europe. Go and talk to the Indians and the Chinese. They don't look at it that way.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. Mostly talking about the supply side. How do you see the balance between investment on creating new renewable energy as opposed to reducing demand by better insulation, by better public transport, things like that?
Well, I mean, the investment in renewable energy last year matched the investment in oil and gas. So renewable energy is attracting a lot of investment. A lot of that is going on electric vehicles. That is a success story. I mean, electric vehicles will have an impact. But it's a fallacy to believe that because we are replacing petrol-driven vehicles by electric vehicles, suddenly oil and gas consumption is going down. I'm afraid that oil is going somewhere else, producing plastics. Because as the world economy grows, and Indian economy and Chinese economy grows, guess what happens? We need more plastics. So there are now evidence that about 20% of the oil and gas supply by 2050 will now be channeled towards producing even more plastics. So it's not an easy balance to achieve.
But about building insulation and things like that,
It's happening. It's happening. There is more investment, but it's as you probably know, since you're asking a question, the IEA has been pushing massively on energy efficiency, which includes that, and it's a struggle. I mean, there is energy efficiency is receiving investment, but take, for example, Cyprus. How much are we investing in energy efficiency and insulation and heating? Almost nothing. It's a struggle. There is a realization, and I believe it's going to happen more and more. But even standing in this room here now, we are in an energy crisis, and I am burning. The heat is very high. Should be going down. So there is a realization that energy efficiency, insulation, and everything else, that bringing heating costs down, it's going to benefit the world. And it's certainly the IEA said that energy efficiency is the biggest fuel in the world. Use it. We are not using it efficiently. Kostas.
Thank you, Charles. As always, very provoking and very informative. So, but I'll challenge some of, just to make the discussion a little bit lively. First of all, what the oil industry is doing is like expecting the tobacco industry to accelerate getting rid of smoking. Of course, they want to prolong as long as they can. There are investments of probably approaching 100 trillion euros there that has to get their money back.
Yes.
No wonder that BlackRock, BP, etc., sadly, they say, oh, what can we do? It has to be prolonged. Your presentation was objective. You are stating facts. I didn't see any. But the other side is that this is untenable. Climate change, and now it's so solid, the predictions, if this happens, and exactly what is happening and projecting from it, the magnitude of the disaster that this implies, it's beyond actually modeling. You are beyond the tipping points, and nobody would know how to do it. So I take the message, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what is happening. You gave us excellent projection, and it's sad. It's leading to a climate disaster.
Yeah.
That is not being challenged. In the name of reality, let's face it, realism, that is what is happening, and we have to accept it. Yes, the nature will not accept it.
Yeah.
And the calamity is far bigger than any investment needed to take account of this, quote, reality, and which is, in a way, projected by entrenched big interest here. It's natural. The energy industry, which is fed by all this, has every interest to prolong it a little bit longer. So if I take your message there, I'll say, wow, I shouldn't be sleeping tonight. What is coming is a calamity of unmeasured proportions, and therefore, the message I take from your talk is the opposite, that we better start spending the 6 trillion per year, because we'll not have enough trillions to contain the damage that this realistic scenario, realistic meaning business as usual, really what you are showing us, I would say it's the business as usual scenario implies. Is my reading of your talk right or wrong?
No, I share everything you say. We must do something about it. I don't believe these trends will continue all the way to 2050. I believe that as we approach the 2030s, there is going to be more success with renewables, and the need for coal especially, but also oil and gas, will go down. But let me give you an example. The first country in Europe to introduce renewable energy at scale and make policies driven by renewable energy was Germany, Energiewende. What happened last year to Germany? They reduced gas consumption and they brought more coal, 20% more coal. Where is Energiewende? Where is all these policies for? So reality caught up with them, and they had no choice but to go back to coal. And they said, no, no, don't worry, it's temporary. And as I showed you, going back to coal is not temporary. It takes a long time to get rid of it.
I will agree with everything you said, except I wouldn't call reality. I would call it political expediency. Well, it's a choice, but not reality. There is no law of physics that says that. That's not reality.
Except for one thing. Who pays for it? Costs, energy prices skyrocketed. It's not just because of oil and gas. It's policies that drive these things, policies that make it happen. And if you go and, despite reality, as I call it, you push for renewables, and you shut down oil and gas, and the world is not ready for that, the only thing is going to happen is that the prices will go further up, and then it's not a solution. You need to find a balance between the two. You must find a balance. We must find a balance. We must find a balance between making sure the oil and gas we need is there, but we try to get rid of it if we can, while bringing up renewables to take its place. We're not there. We are a long way from it. And as I said, everything we have done to date on renewables is only really affecting electricity. We're doing something about cleaning electricity. All the other sectors have a long, long way to go, a long way to go. And electricity is only 20% of the world's energy use right now. We say that by 2050 it will become 50%, but we're not at 2050.
Thanks for the interesting presentation here. So I really agree with what was mentioned in the beginning, that we're no longer looking into mitigation strategies, but adaptation strategies. My question is, public perception on nuclear energy is pretty negative, but it could be used as the intermediate step there, and now we're going back to coal instead of nuclear. What is your opinion in that? Would we see more nuclear in the future?
I think so. I think nuclear is being rehabilitated, especially small-scale nuclear is gaining ground. Even the United Nations, only a few weeks ago, approved the first significant small-scale nuclear project. It's gaining ground. And within Europe, the value of nuclear was shown when you compare Germany with France. Germany prematurely shut down the nuclear power plants, and I'm afraid that loss of energy wasn't replaced by renewables. Renewables couldn't respond to that. It was replaced by coal. France carried on with nuclear energy, and it has been exporting nuclear energy to the rest of Europe, except for one thing, of course. During the summer last year, with the drought, half of the nuclear power plants in France were not functioning. So even France was importing gas to make up reduction in power generation from nuclear power plants. It's not an easy equation. There is you have to balance all of these things together. But I certainly believe that nuclear is up and coming. Certainly, China is investing a lot in nuclear, and other countries are going back to that.
Thanks. Isn't it a bit of a political or policy mistake to leave it up to the energy companies to resolve what is really a seriously critical question for the future of the planet? You know, I mean, they're looking to people like Exxon to decide, okay, yeah, let's get into renewables and really do this right, because I don't think that those companies aren't interested. I mean, aren't the political bodies, the governments, et cetera, going to have to force force the hand of these companies if they're the ones who are dishing out the money towards the investments in these alternative fuels? I mean, for one thing, I don't think anybody really, maybe some did, but everybody really imagined that we could do away with fossil fuels entirely, especially natural gas. You've got to have some kind of backup. But from what I read, it does seem like the oil companies are willing to take their sweet old time about making the transition. And I think that at some point it's going to become so obvious that the governments are going to have to, or somebody, put their foot down.
But, Gary, that's why all these subsidies have gone into renewables, to encourage the development of other industries, not relying on the oil companies for renewables. There is a huge growth in new companies developing renewables and subsidized, which is the right way to do it. The oil companies will be oil companies. They have been at the receiving end of policies and legislation in Europe and the United States, especially in Europe, but that hasn't worked. All of these policies to get rid of oil and gas in Europe are not working. So that's why I keep saying we need a balance. And relying on the oil companies to bring in renewables is, I agree with you, it's not going to happen, but we are not relying on the oil companies to bring in renewables. The oil companies will have a role to play in renewables using their skills. And when I say skills, they're not very good in generating wind power or solar power. Certainly, in terms of biomethane, biogas, in terms of hydrogen, that's their business. So gas, for example, is the business and the skills of the oil companies.
While we're on that, I want to ask you, can we continue this discussion? We have another question, and then we can continue the discussion.
Yeah. Charles, I wanted to ask you, if I recall correctly, it was 2 years ago that the director of the European Investment Bank made a statement and said, gas is over. I remember that statement. And of course, from what you're projecting, you're saying it will be with us, with the consequences. But what would you advise for those wanting to develop their fields? Because your projection really predicts that we have the gas we need anyway. As you know, 50% of all the gas that exists is in use, so we have an oversupply of gas anyway. So what would you advise those that are hoping to develop their fields, if you were asked?
Well, those who want to invest in the fields will not invest unless policies change. So it's not up to them, it's up to governments, entities like Europe to change their policies and recognize that gas is going to be there for some time to come.
And there is an oversupply. There is the gas.
There is. I mean, the proven reserves are quite significant, but potential gas supply, potential gas reserves in the world are enormous. We are still a long way from utilizing what is there. I mean, even the projections are, as you said, are by 2050. The world will not even have used 50% of what is up, or what is potentially there. So we can, if the governments, if the European Union and the rest come to the oil companies and say, okay, yes, we are going to sign a few 20-year contracts, they will go and do it because the gas is there, the investment is there. They have plenty of money, believe me. Last year they made ginormous profits. They're going to make ginormous profits this year. They want to invest, but they will not invest if nobody can guarantee them 20-year contracts. So we need to find that balance between.
So you're predicting another crisis.
Yes.
So you're saying that if they don't relax their policy on what they're saying, we're going to go into another crisis.
We will, and it's either that or Europe deindustrializes. So we get rid of our industry, our heavy industry, send it to the United States, send it to the Middle East. We become a service continent, not relying on industry anymore, reduce the energy needs of Europe dramatically, and then maybe we'll get some kind of solution, but that is not a solution. And in the meanwhile, I assure you, the oil companies are not sitting there. I don't know if you heard, talking about our part of the world, a couple of weeks ago, Chevron made a presentation to their shareholders. They are now close to making a decision to use a floating LNG production facility on top of Leviathan in Israel that has a lot of free gas, and develop it and export it to Asia. So Europe is going to lose that. They are also investing more in Egypt, where the ENI is looking for more LNG for Italy and for Europe, so for Italy specifically. And so Chevron is investing there. There was no reference to Cyprus, zero. Not a mention about Cyprus, not a mention about Aphrodite or anything. They have said nothing. And for me, and I'm going to write an article about this, because our minister keeps telling us that 2027 we will be exporting gas from Aphrodite. Well, believe me, if Chevron is going to spend money on a major project, they have no option but to go and present it to their shareholders and get their plans approved before they actually do it. So if this year they didn't say anything about Cyprus, it's because they don't really have any plans for Cyprus yet. They're not ready. And the reason is what I said, that even if they're concerned, and the same applies to ExxonMobil, ExxonMobil told me that as far as Cyprus is concerned, yes, they're sitting there and they're interested, but they don't believe anything is going to happen before the end of the decade. So they are doing a lot of exploration, a lot of preparation. They want to find more gas, and they want to be ready by the end of the decade to consider exporting that gas. But at the moment, ExxonMobil also here in Nicosia, when was the Economist Conference in Nicosia? They came here and they said, they pleaded, they turned to Europe and said, we want to develop this gas and bring it to you. Please give us long-term contracts. Zero response.
So let's take the last question by Kostas Kartalis, and then we can continue.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I keep a positive message from the presentation that we have to phase out oil and natural gas in order to preserve the climate and preserve the planet. And that's a starting point with respect to what we are supposed to do. I'm looking all this time this graph that you have placed in the screen. And you know that there are more graphs with respect to this while they take into consideration the prospects of technology, for instance, for storage, for the grid system to be expanded, for energy efficiency that has been measured, and for CDR. And in this case, the results are much better with respect to the prospects. At the same time, I listened also to the other questions, and you said that if the companies are being given a prospect for 20 years contract, but the target is not 2030. The target for the phase-out, for net zero, as a matter of fact, but not the phase-out, is 2050. So they do have this. They do have the period to do the investments and adjust to the new system. And to be more clear with respect to this, net zero is a story, and the European Commission is speaking about net zero, which means that everybody knows that it's not going to be zero. It's going to be something
net zero,
that has
yes.
to be replaced, has to be removed from the atmosphere.
Totally agree with everything,
So,
except for one thing.
okay, go on.
Europe is not setting the policies to allow these long-term contracts. So European utilities last year signed almost no long-term contracts. I mean, the buyers, Europe is not buying this gas. It's the European utilities that are buying the gas. And the European utilities are not signing long-term contracts because they follow European policy, and European policy embodied in Fit for 55, in Repower EU, discourages them from doing that, simply because if Europe keeps saying that we want to get rid of gas and by 2030 down 30%, beyond that we want to carry on getting rid of it and get rid of it altogether, European utilities won't sign long-term contracts because on a take or pay basis, if they won't be able to take it if it happens, but they have to pay. So they're not going to sign the long-term contracts. The oil companies won't do it. So we need to strike, I mean, that's what I keep saying. We need to strike that balance. It's what Stavros said about the EIB. It's a bit like George Bush, who stood on the warship outside Kuwait after Iraq and said, "Mission accomplished." I'm afraid mission wasn't accomplished. And the same thing is happening now.
If you allow me, since the discussion has also taken care about EIB, EIB has decided not to give any more loans with respect to companies that are been investing in
gas.
fossil fuels.
Yeah.
But what is important to see in EIB too is the stress test with respect to the capacity to cover the loans, because, as you know, once they were giving loans to fossil fuel investments, they were getting bonds from the investment. So at the moment, EIB is exposed with respect to the bonds that have been given to fossil fuel companies. So it's more complicated as compared to a simple discussion whether renewables are enough to compensate for the reduction of natural gas and oil. But again, the message, and I can see it in this graph as well, it's the target is 2050. It's not 2030. 2030 is an intermediate step, which will demonstrate the capacity of the international community to fulfill the goals. And as a last point, Thodoros, you said that the crisis was in 2021, the energy crisis. It started in 2021. When did it start? It started when the planet was getting out of the COVID crisis, pretty much. And at that time, a number of countries, oil and natural gas production countries, decided to reduce the production. It was Trinidad, Nigeria, Norway, Arab countries. And that developed the crisis. It wasn't the Green Deal of the European Union that developed the energy crisis. It was a decision of a number of producing countries to reduce the production.
Completely disagree with that. They didn't reduce production. They merely couldn't respond to the increased demand. The production didn't go down. It's demand that went up. They couldn't respond to the increased demand simply because during the 5 years prior to that, they stopped investing in new fields to develop so that they would be ready to produce more when it was needed. So production didn't go down. Demand went up and couldn't respond. And why they couldn't respond? As I said, because they stopped investing, simply because of the messages from Europe and the United States telling them to stop investing. I mean, I should remind you that before coronavirus, the IEA, International Energy Agency, published a report saying, we have all the gas and oil we need, no more investments in exploration and production after middle of this decade. That was a fallacy. That was the governments, politicians seized on that and put even more pressure on the oil companies to stop investing. And we are paying the consequences of that now. It's not that production went down. Production hasn't gone down. I mean, I showed you, let me go back again. No, but look, the production is going up.
No, I said in September and October, fall 2021.
No, but demand went up. Production didn't necessarily go down. It's demand that was the problem. It's a different thing. The oil companies would be delighted to produce more, but they couldn't.
Okay.
How can it be artificial when, as I said to you, two things happened. The wind speeds went down in Europe. Wind energy, as a result, cube factor, 8.8 to the power of 3. You can imagine how much reduction in wind power we had for a long period. Nuclear plants were not functioning properly. So not only the passing of coronavirus increased demand in oil and gas, but in Europe we also had this additional problem that the renewable energy, wind and nuclear, was not performing as expected. So that had to be covered by even more gas. And where was it going to come from? At the same time, Russia was reducing supplies for political reasons. I mean, and the problem became convoluted.
Okay, I think there are dozens of issues that we could discuss.
Yes.
We would need another hour. So perhaps it was wrong that we invited you for a colloquium, perhaps for a panel discussion where we would have more time. But we can continue outside with cheese and fruit. I would like to thank you very much. Remind the audience that in 2 weeks we will have a speech from Carl Janssen, the new ERA chair professor on quantum computing. So this will be the next series in our lectures. So let's thank very much Mr. Ellinas, and we'll continue outside.
Thank you.